Hello, and welcome to today's webinar as part of this year's Smart Money Week in Agriculture, brought to you by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Center for Agricultural Profitability and Nebraska Extension, with support from the North Central Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Center. I'm Shannon Sand, Extension Educator and Agricultural Economist with the Center for Ag Profitability. Through daily webinars this week, Ag Smart Money Week aims to equip farmers and ranchers with the latest tools, information, and strategies to improve their financial management and risk management to build success in their business. You can find the full schedule and registration information on the Center for Ag Profitability's website, cap.unl.edu/smartmoney. This webinar will highlight the latest trends in Nebraska land values and cash rental rates and offer insight into lease arrangements, outlining some pitfalls to watch out for in land contracts, as well as proper methods to overcome challenges. To present, we are joined by Jim Jansen, agricultural economist with Nebraska Extension. Jim serves the Northeast part of the state, and he co-heads or co-leads the annual Nebraska Farm Real Estate Market Survey here at UNL, which publishes updated cash rental rates and land values every year. We invite anyone with questions during the presentation to be typed into the chat box or the Q&A. Jim, I'll turn it over to you now.
All right, so just give me a minute here and I will get everything up and going. Okay. All right, does everything look okay on your end, Shannon? I believe so if you aren't saying
Looks great.
anything. All right, very good. Okay, so many of you have come to some of our prior outreach that we've done before on this topic of land values and cash rental rates. What I intend to do today is give a basic overview on what's happening in land values, cash rental rates, and give some ideas and some helpful tips, hopefully along the way, on lease arrangements, things to keep an eye out for, things of that nature. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And if you'd like to visit one-on-one with me, you can take note of either my email or phone number. We have a few things coming up due here at work here over the next week and a half, but beyond that, I'd be more than happy to visit with you one-on-one, whether that's Shannon, Anastasia Meyer in the south, Jessica Gross-Qua out west, or Shannon Sand in North Platte. So go ahead and get started. A few things just to keep in mind, some of you may not be aware, annually the University of Nebraska does a survey on those folks that work in the land industry. Each year we do two different things. We do first what is called the preliminary estimates. That's a snapshot of not just land values, but also cash rental rates. In the middle of March, that information gets published. And then the final report gets published in June, and that has all the preliminary estimates information in addition to things like the attributes of land sales. What percent of land is being sold via cash or contract for deed, things of that nature. The Center for Ag Profitability website, you can take a look at this information, is found at cap.unl.edu/real estate. The other option you have is to contact your local extension office. Many of the office managers across the state usually have a couple pages printed out from our report. They can give you a better snapshot on land values or cash rents if you'd like them to maybe either send you something or even just copying off a few pages and stop by and picking them up. In the state of Nebraska, just a little bit of the geography of the state here, we have 93 counties that are composed of a wide varieties of different types of land. We have irrigated and dryland cropland in addition to grazing land. About half our state is grazing land. The other half is either irrigated or dryland cropland. We have more irrigated cropland in Nebraska than any other state, so it definitely sets us apart. We also have a very robust livestock industry, cattle on feed, cow-calf pairs, swine, growing broiler or poultry industry here as well. And tying all these things together, what we've done in the past and what we'll continue to do into the future here is we have a snapshot of the state of Nebraska, and all 93 counties are subdivided into the 8 different regions. These 8 different regions are referred to as agricultural statistic districts, or some of you may be more familiar with the crop reporting districts. If you ever hear of that term, that's what these regions are as well. So what we'll do today is we're going to kind of start big, and we'll work our way down to the region, and eventually we'll work our way down to the farm level examples on how to set cash rent. Okay. So first few things, I just received an email the other day, and maybe when I respond to the email, I'll just send a copy of this presentation out. But they wanted to know what's the outlook on land values and cash rents for the next 3, 4, 5 years. Now that's a long ways out, and there's going to be a lot of things happening just get alone to with the elections today, but also the profitability of farming and ranching. That's the core thing to look at. Where is profitability of ag headed? Is it going to be where we're at right now? Is it going to look like it did 2 years ago? Those things are the things that influence what we're going to see on land values. And first thing to note, when we talk about the market value of something, the market value is always a point in time. So the estimated market value we have on the slide here is as of February 1, 2024, compared 1 year prior. So February 1, 2024 against February 1, 2023. What do you notice? Well, depending on where you're at in the state, this is an all ag land value. So as I mentioned before, Pete took into account all those different types of land, which we call land classes. The 8 different types that we have reported here are reported on this slide. Some areas we had very small changes. Some areas were a little bit more, maybe in the northeast and central versus, say, the panhandle being the northwest or the southwest regions. And some of these things may reflect the type of land, availability of water, presence of grazing land versus cropland, things like that. And if you took this all statewide value and put it up on the chart for the last 40 or 45 years, that's what we're going to see on the next slide here. So when I introduce this section, I always say in my presentations too, is we have to look at the profitability of whatever we're doing if we want to understand what the value of it is or what people might be paying to lease that asset. So what do we notice on here? Well, the blue line is the Nebraska all land ag land value. In the red line, we got the marketing year average price of corn. Now, corn is the only crop they grow in every county in the state, even in the Sandhills. We don't grow a lot of it, but there is some growing out there. Use the price of corn, soybeans, wheat, other major commodities, prices of livestock. What do you notice? Well, it seems to me there's somewhat of a lagged effect between the market value versus the asset value. So, excuse me, the market value of what we're raising, corn, soybeans like that, versus the value of land. There's a lagged effect. And the first time we set this very high price was back around that 2008 to 2012. About a decade later, we've set something very similar to what we're seeing here right now. The one thing to point out, the market value of cropland peaked first. And then about 1 to 2 years later, prices of cattle were much higher. Prices of corn subsided some, but the prices of cattle were quite good. And the prices of the land classes, grazing land, hayland, things like that, that peaked about 1 to 2 years later. So the value of what we have relates to the value of what you're doing with it. So if I get my crystal ball out, all else equal, unless we see something turn around here, it looks like profitability, and I'm not saying we're going to go see a drop of 20%, but just looking at this chart and kind of evaluating some of the different economics of what's occurring in Nebraska, things might soften a little bit. When we've seen a little bit of a regression here in value, we didn't see drops of 10%, 20%. We did see an increase of almost 35% or so over the last 3 years. If we see a gradual change either up or down, that's what we're shooting for. We want to see gradual changes over time. The other thing to keep in mind is the cost of borrowing money. And I just updated this slide here about a week ago. And on this slide, we have what is called the 10-year Treasury yield rate, or what people commonly refer to as a T-bill. Now, I'm not suggesting you can go and get a 20 or 30-year ag land loan for, let's say, 4%. During COVID, there was some very low interest rates. There's a spread between the T-bill rate and the current financing rate. I haven't looked recently, but I would suspect a lot of land loans are probably hovering around that 7% rate, give or take a little bit, depending on your financial situation. But this is an indication that interest rates, while they have subsided a little bit, they're definitely much higher here since the advent of COVID, COVID-19 to current. Things are much higher now than they've been in quite a few years. You almost have to go back 15 years or so to see what we've seen right here, back to 2008. So Interest rates, there's an inverse relationship. The higher the interest rates, they tend to weigh down on the real estate market, homes, vehicles, equipment, land, all else equal. Unless we see additional profitability to offset the cost of borrowing, we tend to see we tend to see that inverse relationship. So that those higher interest rates over time tend to weigh down on the market value of the land a little bit. Okay, so two things in your crystal ball: land market value of land, profitability of farming and ranching, and the cost of borrowing. Those are the two things I would keep an eye on if you're interested in the market value of land over the next 1, 3, 5 years, whatever the case might be. Now, with some of the higher real estate values, real estate taxes have been in the news again. And I couldn't find one consistent article that I could find everything I wanted. So what I'll attempt to do here is try to break this down the best I can and explain it in a way that hopefully those of you that own land or a home in Nebraska can make some sense of this. Back in, I think it was 2019, 2020, December of 2019, LB is Legislative Bill 1107 was passed. This legislative bill provided a small income tax credit through what was called the property tax credit, the PTC. This property tax credit applied to your K through 12 initially, and in recent years it also applied to the portion of real estate taxes, a small portion of the real estate taxes that goes to the local community college. How this worked was, for example, you had your 2022 property taxes that most people paid during the late spring and early summer of 2023. And then after the first of the year, you got an income tax credit. Well, LB 34, which I will outline on the next slide here, and this was an article that came right out of verbatim. And this is an excerpt of that. So full credit goes to the Nebraska Examiner here on this next slide too. And you can find this, it's a really good read on what changes were made. But LB 34 made some changes. Specifically, it made some changes to the K through 12. Notice I didn't say community college. The K through 12 property tax credit. After this credit was passed, the portion of the PTC, the property tax credit that goes through K through 12, it's now going to appear on your annual tax assessment notice. So 2023 here, unless you paid your real estate taxes before December 31, 2023 for the 2023 tax year, this year we will not be receiving this property tax credit for the portion that goes through K through 12. We're going to be seeing this directly applied to our property tax bill unless something changes by the state legislature. We're going to start seeing this appear on our annual tax assessment when you get your notice here in late fall or early winter, usually before the first of the year. And this portion of the credit is going to automatically start appearing on your property tax credit or on your annual tax assessment notice. So you will not have to make out the property tax credit to get your K through 12 rebate. The but I'm going to throw in here is the legislation did not include the portion that goes to your local community college. Previously, we made out the property tax credit to get both the credit for the K through 12 and community college. Now we are going to be making out the property tax credit for the portion that goes to your local community college. Another change that occurred here is this 5 to 6%, and this might be a little bit high, but it's a very small sliver of your overall tax bill. The state is going to be, if I'm not mistaken, rebating 100% of the portion that goes to your local community college. I'd keep an eye on the Nebraska state legislature, and I do think that this will eventually get rolled into your annual tax assessment notice, so you don't have to make out this property tax credit form like you will. So once again, if you want to make out, and this was a quote from Nebraska state legislature, if you want the property tax credit for the community college, you must still make out that form, but the portion that goes through K through 12, that's going to be automated. It'll be automated in terms of it'll start showing up on your annual tax assessment notice. Okay. All right, and I just had a comment confirm that yes, 100%, the state of Nebraska will be refunding 100% of the portion of real estate taxes that goes to your local community college district. Keep an eye on the legislature. I bet this issue will be there again. I'm trying to keep my opinions out of this. Keep an eye on this. I bet they'll eventually roll this credit into your annual tax assessment notice. But as the way the current law stands, this is what kind of a breakdown on what we're seeing. And this article was an excerpt taken from the Lincoln Journal-Star. They had an article on September 3rd, and once again, they did a very nice job summarizing some of the major changes. And frankly, I can't write this any better than what the article here outlines. So that's why we did an excerpt on here. Okay, switching gears back, market value of land. There are different land classes. I'm not going to dig into all the different land classes. Just note that depending on where you're at in the state, so we have dryland, cropland with or without irrigation potential, that will influence the market value of your asset. Grazing land non-tillable, we also have grazing land tillable. Without digging into the other slide too much, you're going to notice that the percent change, not the overall dollars per acre, but the percent change a little bit higher for the land classes that support directly to the cow-calf industry compared to, let's say, dryland, cropland, where it was mostly just single digits, low or single digits. You know, people ask me the question, is 2% or 13% good? We like to see gradual changes over time. 2% up, 2% down. That, to me, that says the market's fairly stable. 13% definitely is noticeable in this slide here. But this is just a breakdown of grazing land non-tillable. And the other type of land that people frequently ask on is center pivot irrigated cropland. And on center pivot irrigated cropland, we've seen a much more conservative number reported in terms of the percent change year over year. And with this percent change year over year, we see single digits, once again, is 2% or 3% or 3% down. Is that really a notable change? Or is that to say the markets has moderated maybe? That might be the approach that I would look at. What's influencing the market value of land? That's a question that we're trying to ask. And when we ask that question on our real estate report, we ask a set of economic forces on a scale of 1 to 5. So 1 being the most negative, 3 being neutral, and then 5 being the most positive. And then we put it into what I call a tornado chart here. And what you notice is things that we mentioned before. So interest rates, property taxes, current crop prices, they're definitely starting to weigh down on the real estate market to some extent. Current livestock prices are something that's leading to higher real estate values, 1031 tax exchanges, things like that. So my first tip that I'm going to give on leases for 2025, what are the challenges that real estate owners, landowners in Nebraska, what are they facing? They're retired, being on a fixed income, they're facing high property taxes. Now, the legislature has done some things to attempt to address that and keep an eye on that. I think there'll be more to come there. But on the other side of that, what are tenants facing? Rising input expenses, and we'll talk about over the next few slides here about that, and interest rates. So the question that comes up a lot of the time is, when is the cash rent due? Some people say it has to be due the day the lease is signed. Some people say it's all due when the crop is harvested or the cattle are taken off the property and the calves are sold or something to that effect. What I tell people, I tend to see some asking for a portion of the cash rent up front. It's not uncommon to see that. Maybe half the cash rent up front when the lease is signed. Why is that? Well, it's a show of good faith. But the other thing is, what does a landowner have to pay twice over the upcoming late spring, early summer, or midsummer, I guess you might say? Real estate taxes. Now, the flip side of that is if you're working with a beginning producer and you want all the cash rent up front day one when the lease is signed, what are they going to have to be paying? Probably going to be paying 8 to 10% interest on the line of credit. So your cash rent is going to be about 8 to 10% higher if they have to borrow those funds. So keep that in mind. It's a balancing act. These are the challenges that we're facing in the negotiations surrounding farmland leases. Now, a few things to note. The big three that we like to talk about: seed, fertilizer, and chemical prices. And this information is pulled from the DTN. They're based in Omaha. They do a very nice job summarizing different things in the news. And I just posted two different types of very commonly utilized fertilizer. The red here is the 2024 average price. So we start in January and go all the way over to December on each of these charts. This tattered gray line is the last 5-year average. 2022 was, after COVID. 2023 was last year, and then we're here in this year. I will say with the inputs, there's a little bit of seasonality into pricing fertilizers. Certain products tend to kind of taper off a little bit, or sometimes go a little bit higher depending on where you're at and who applies what when. But at least fertilizer prices on average have been averaging a little bit lower than they had in recent years. So that's a good thing. I think we're getting closer to more of the seasonal average. The one challenge we're facing are interest rates. And I pulled this article here from the Kansas City Federal Reserve. The Omaha branch office puts out a couple different things. One of the things they put out, I believe this was the Ag Credit Survey, and they always do a very nice job in summarizing different things. And they have operating loans. So this would be an example like a line of credit. And if I'm not mistaken, they pegged it at about 9% currently. So these, many operators across the state are going to be renewing their line of credits. So interest rates now compared to, let's say, in 2022, 3 times as high as they were. Well, 2.5 times, 1.5 times. Excuse me, I was looking at the wrong line here. But definitely, let's say 5 to 9, that's a 4%. That's almost 1.75 times is what it was. So if you wanted everything paid up front during COVID, yes, you had to pay interest, but it's about half of what we're facing right now. And same way with financing of real estate. Real estate's here in purple. I guessed it at about 7%, but say it's 7.5, or whatever here in Nebraska. Interest rates are definitely trending higher. We'll see with the general economy slowing down a little bit if the Federal Reserve does some things to maybe subside or back off on these interest rates. But nonetheless, if you're negotiating things on leases, you got to see both sides of it. And the challenge that we're facing is, yes, certain inputs are down, so be sure to visit with your tenant about that. If you're a landlord, and if you're a tenant, you don't have to show them your pocket or your checkbook in your pocket. But can you explain to them on a per acre basis? Yes, and fertilizer prices are more towards the historic average, but chemical or seed prices haven't subsided as much. Whatever. The big three: seed, fertilizer, chemicals, and in the cases of irrigated cropland, we'll just call it energy, diesel, electricity, whatever it might be. So first part we're going to cover today, we covered on land values. Where have they been? Kind of hints on where they might be headed. The second part we're going to be talking today on are cash rental rates. So what we're going to do is we're going to start big. Sometimes you have to know where you've been in 2024 to gain some insight on where you might be headed in 2025. So first thing, put on your economist hat here for a minute. What are you seeing? We're seeing a mixed response. Some areas are down slightly, some areas are up a little bit, some areas were steady. Seems to me that we had a fairly mixed response on the dryland, cropland, cash rental rates in 2024. And in addition to this, we have a range here, the breakout from the low third average to the high third average and the overall average. In our report, we call it the low grade and the high grade. When we ask people that take the survey, what is the low grade and the high grade, we just ask you, what do you estimate the low third average is, and what do you estimate the high third average is on cash rental rates? So what is the low third average? What is the high third average? And what influences cash rents? Quality of the land, soil type, degree of slope, configuration of the field. Do you have a nice 160 acre parcel, or do you have a bunch of these 160 acre pieces that make up 160 acres, or chopped up by a ditch or a stream? Maybe they're smaller parcels. There's nothing wrong with a smaller parcel of land, but if you're dealing with a tenant that has a 12, 16, 24 row planter, it gets harder to navigate those things even with auto steer and some of these things. So there's definitely a component of value. And also inside of each district, historically, the farther east you move in Nebraska, the more rain we get. Southeast Nebraska, 34 inches. Northwest Nebraska, maybe 12 to 14. So if you're in, let's say, Washington County compared to York County, they're both very nice counties to be in. Washington County might get more consistent rainfall than, let's say, York. So just be aware of that. And that might get packed into the bids that are getting made for offers on renting cropland. So you got to step back 2024, where have we been? 2025, how are we negotiating our leases? And when it comes to negotiating those leases, how are things stacking up? What is their expectation for prices of just not the inputs, but the different commodities, corn, soybeans, wheat, dry edible beans, hay, alfalfa, whatever you're raising? Where's that headed? Where does that look like? What does that look like? Another source of cash rental rates comes from the USDA. The USDA has a division called NASS. NASS stands for the National Agricultural Statistics Survey. I'm sure some of you maybe have been contacted by a statistician or an enumerator, someone that helps conduct surveys. And their survey, they publish their analysis of county level cash rents, typically around the middle of September. Their map of the state of Nebraska, I was able to update it for our presentation here. And it gives a breakdown here for the 2024 growing season, the average county level cash rents reported. A few things to note. Is there a lot of cropland out in the sandhills? And there might be some hayland, but not a lot of cropland. So that's one reason we don't see a number reported here. And in some counties here, Merrick, Hamilton, and Clay, these are heavily irrigated areas. In some of these counties, they don't get enough responses back, or in some of these other counties here as well. If you do not get enough responses back reported to the survey, there will not be a number published for this year. So that's why we're seeing what we see here on this. Okay, so if you want the survey numbers, got to respond to that survey. These numbers are important, just not for having a nice map and a presentation here on a rainy day in Nebraska. They influence different things. Federal farm policies, cash rental rates that are offered for the Conservation Reserve Program acres that get enrolled. They're tied to a degree to some of these numbers. I'm not saying they're paying exactly $240 an acre. They make adjustments based on the soil type and other premiums or discounts associated with the bid contract, but they definitely do have an impact. So be sure to respond to these surveys if you do get surveyed. Let's move on to irrigated rates here. The University of Nebraska reports just not on the center pivot irrigated rental rates, but they also report on what we call the gravity or flood irrigated rates. Once again, you got some mixed numbers here. Some areas were down a little bit, some areas were up. You know, is a 1% increase, is that really an increase, or does that basically say cash rents are overall steady? I would call them steady. What do we see here? Well, based on these mixed responses, once again, we have differences in cash rental rates based on different areas of the state here. And we go from the low third average to the high third average and the overall average. What influences irrigated rental rates? Well, once again, the farther east you are in a certain region, even with irrigated cropland, we tend to get more consistency in rainfall, maybe not quite as much hail or adverse weather sometimes. Also, the irrigation district you're in. Are you in an area where they restrict significantly how much water can be put on? Do they not have quite as many restrictions? The irrigation equipment. These rates assume that the landlord provides the entire irrigation system, pivot, pump, and power unit. As a tenant, do you have to provide one of those things? And I'll provide some estimates on what you might discount the cash rent if you do provide the pivot or the power unit. Also, do you have an irrigation system that you can turn on and off with a smartphone or a computer or whatever, distantly or remotely, or be able to monitor the field? Some fields have the ability to have precision water applied. It varies how much water is put on the ground. All those different things influence the irrigated rates. For the sake of time, I'm not going to cover it today, but they will be in the slides that are posted, or they're definitely inside the real estate report. The center pivot rates tend to rent about $30 to $50 an acre more than what the gravity or flood irrigated rates. For one of those reasons being is this rate is returned just on the land, but for the upkeep and improvement of the or depreciation of the equipment on these properties. Okay. Now, the thing you'll notice on the USDA rate, once again, certain areas of the state may not have a lot of irrigation. So that might be some areas of southeast Nebraska, or they couldn't get enough people to respond to it. I know there's irrigated cropland in Nance County, but they didn't get enough people to respond to the survey. The other thing to point out, let's just pick on, say, Adams County here. So this is the Hastings area. In some of these areas along Interstate 80, some of these counties still have a fair amount of flood or gravity irrigation. In that case, these rates that are reported here are a weighted average between the different irrigation practices. So an example, I'm just making this up. Let's say in Clay County, a third of the ground is gravity or flood irrigated and the other 2/3 is center pivot. Well, the numbers that they come up with here, remember the center pivot tends to rent for more than what gravity irrigated rates do. You're going to come up with a weighted average in proportion to the number of acres present for each irrigation practice in the area. Okay. All right, let's switch gears here briefly and talk about grazing land. Percent change wise, it seems to me that we're definitely, there's a few cases in the double digits, but these are not quite as mixed as what center pivot was. Center pivot or dryland, cropland, you had some areas decline, some areas were just up slightly. Well, on average, cattle prices are trending a little bit more favorably for those folks that are looking to sell than what, let's say, corn or soybean prices are. With that being said, the profitability of grazing land is going to be influenced by the grazing land industry. Cow-calf would be probably one of the biggest users. In addition to the average from the prior slide, we have our breakout here from the low third grade to the high third grade and the overall average. What influences grazing land? Well, once again, I keep bringing up rain because depending on where you're at, your grass can be influenced by the consistency and how often that comes. What else? Configuration of the field. Do you have a nice field that makes a really nice grazing land parcel? Is it some really rough land that's hard to navigate on, let's say, a four-wheeler, things like that? All these different things influence the grazing land rental rates. And there's probably 7 or 8 different ways to rent grazing land. You can rent by the acre, the pair, the head, the animal unit, month, the day, the week. Probably some different ways I may not even be the season, but some different ways I may not even be familiar with. So the USDA also reports on a per acre basis. In some of our heavy cropland counties that didn't get enough responses back, that's why some of these are in white. I know Knox County has grazing land, but once again, you have to get a certain number of the producers or percent of the producers to respond to give you some grazing land cash rental rates. But at least in the greater western half of the state, we got some pretty good responses to give us some indication. How do those grazing land cash rents vary? And once again, the farther east Burke County compared to Boone County, Boone County tends to be a little bit lower than Burke County, which is a little bit higher. The other rate that the University of Nebraska reports on this is a cow-calf pair rental rates. This is for one cow, one calf during the typical summer grazing season. So if we want to rent for, let's say, 5, let's pick on Southwest Nebraska here for a second. 60 times 5 would be $300. So if you want to rent by the day, you could always take 16, let's just call it 60. 60 divided by 30 would be $2 a pair per day. If you want to rent by the month, you have the rates here if you want to rent by the season. So you got to be able to work with some of these numbers. And we have a pretty good breakdown depending on where you're at. I think the stocking rate kind of factors into this. In the western part of the state, you probably take typically a lot more pairs, or excuse me, a lot more acres to support one cow-calf pair versus, let's say, Northeast Nebraska. So once again, it depends where you're at. So what have we talked about today? Well, the first part we talked on was on the value of land, kind of the outlook on where things might be headed with that. Second part, we talked on cash rental rates. Where can we find them? How often do they get updated? Some general comments on leases, negotiating. How do we deal with that? I'm going to factor in a little bit more here on how do we calculate some cash rents for 2025. And I'll also give you some good tips for your leases. So first thing, when we talk about all these numbers, you can find different yields. You might be able to find your county yield. Say you talk to a crop insurance agent, they tell you what the county yield is. If you can find out the county rental rate divided by the average county corn yield, that gives us what is called the county rent per bushel. The county rent per bushel at $1.34 a bushel, you slide it to the upper right-hand corner here. Now let's say I'm looking at renting a parcel that produces about 119 bushel instead of 134. It's not quite as good as a county average. You take $1.34 a bushel times the average yield. That gives us the farm level cash rent. We take what we know on the left, we take the regional, we take the county, do some simple division, slide it to the upper right-hand side, and that gives us our APH yield. Or excuse me, our APH yield is our farm-specific yield, the yield over the last 10 years. It's an average that comes from crop insurance. And we figured out the farm level cash rent of, let's say, 160 an acre. Okay. Another thing that we have is called cash equivalent from crop share. Many folks know what a crop share is. The landlord gets a portion of the crop, and depending on for the use of their land, and depending upon how much of the crop they get, influences whether or not they have to pay for some of the expenses. So in this example I have posted here, we have a cash equivalent from crop share. I have a breakdown on our farm. Our farm yields about 160 bushels, so half of that goes to the landlord, half of it goes to the tenant. And I just pulled some numbers from yesterday to demonstrate an example, and I'm not suggesting it's going to be this. Anyone's guess is as good as mine is, just like guessing what's going to happen in the election today. No one knows until you live through it. So let's just say, for the sake of an example, in March of 25, I think the price of corn for the upcoming year is going to be $4.46 a bushel. And the landlord's share of the income minus half of their share of the seed, fertilizer, and chemicals. I adjusted these input prices a little bit, but they're fairly similar from the prior year. And the landlord, if they participated in a crop share, they stand to make about $191.80. Well, it turns out this is a static example. We get later in the growing season, and I didn't let the input expenses or the yield vary, but in this example, we have $3.92 a bushel, and over here we have $4.27. Out of these three, March, July, and November, which one of these make the most sense? Well, if you're a landlord, of course, you want the middle one, tenant, you want this one. I would argue what actually happens. So if you have to settle on a fixed cash rent this upcoming, or if you're trying to figure this out, put together some scenarios for March. Maybe instead of using 446, let's use 426 and 466. Maybe we stay with the 446 example because we think it's most representative of what's going to happen. Once again, the landlord's share of the income minus landlord's share of the expenses is what they make off the crop share, or what I might argue, what we could charge for cash rent, or what we might consider offering. So if the landlord wants $230 a bushel, as a tenant, can you work backwards to this example and say, you know what, your ground isn't capable of producing that much yield, or you're kind of off on your corn price? That's where the negotiation starts. So this is a really good tip for setting 2025 cash rents. I have no idea what this example should be for everyone. I can tell you, can you go through the basic example and explain that? Really good way to figure out cash rent. And another thing, if you have a parcel of ground, let's say you got 20 acres of some ground that's kind of wet that you just leave in grassing. It's fine. You have somebody that wants to put it up for hay. Well, first of all, we don't know what in the world precipitation is going to look like next summer, but on average, it typically yields about 1.5 tons per acre. And we think it's going to be a little drier next summer, and the price of hay is going to be worth, let's say, $100 a ton. It's a really nice, clean grass field, not a lot of weeds. Well, under the 1/3, 2/3 split, the landlord's going to get a third of the hay. The tenant turns around and says, you know what? I weighed a third of the bales. And I think if you don't want that hay, I'll just give you the cash equivalent from our share lease. We're going to buy out the landlord's share of the crop and use that for a cash rent. And this example I have right here, this says, okay, if the landlord gets half the crop and they paid for half of the fertilizer expenses, well, in this example, I didn't even realize it until I started going through it today, but it's pretty similar cash rent. So just because if the landlord, if you want more, you just got to be aware that if you want to collect more of that, you're going to have to probably start paying for some of those input expenses. So just be aware of that if that's something you want to negotiate in there. Those people that bear more risk in a crop share might be the ones that get a little bit more reward. Question, I hinted at this before. We did a little work here in 2023. The take home on this, who's responsible for maintaining that irrigation system out on irrigated cropland? Well, based on our responses, about half of it was between the landlord and the tenant. Third of the time, the tenant took care of everything. The other time, the landlord or some other service took care of it. If the tenant is the one providing the pivot, so you have an irrigated parcel of land, the tenant is the one providing the pivot for whatever reason, and you think the irrigated cash rent should be a certain dollar per acre. Well, guess what? If the tenant provides a pivot, they're providing the upkeep for the pivot, insurance, repairs. Well, about half the time you take off, you discount the irrigated cash rent to account for the fact that the tenant is the one providing the irrigation pivot, the center pivot irrigation system. I would say based on my phone calls, 26 is actually even a little low given the current cost of the replacing the system and that. I've heard a lot of numbers around $35 to $40 an acre. That's just purely based on my phone calls. Third of the time, 10 to 25. The remainder of the time, either the discount was not given, which is a very small percent reported, and about 10% of the time, 10% of the time, it was more than $50 an acre. Something that might be a little bit more common is the discount per acre if the tenant provides the power unit, so like a diesel engine. So once again, you have an irrigated parcel of land. The landlord owns the land, the pivot, everything, but they don't own that diesel engine or propane engine or electric motor, whatever. Under that case, about a third of the time you take off 1 to 9, another third of the time you take off 10 to 20. I would tell you, I've seen a lot of people in my negotiations, but my consultation based off our phone calls, we see around $10 to $20 an acre taken off in cash rent for those individuals that provide the power unit. Once again, if the tenant provides it, the landlord doesn't have to maintain it. They don't have to be worried about theft or someone doing something to it that's not appropriate. They don't have to be worried about upkeep, overhauling the engine every so many hours, thousands or whatever. Those are the kind of things to keep an eye on. A little bit newer work, and this is a lot of information to unpack on here. We did a look at cover crops and farmland leases. Few take homes. In Nebraska, we have about 21 million acres of cropland, of which about 925,000 acres have a cover crop grown on them, a little less than 5% of the total acres. And we have about 36,000 operators that plant crops in the state. Of those, just shy of 4,500 plant cover crops. And overall, about 10 to 12% are planting cover crops. If you have a lease situation, why are that, the tenant or landlord or whoever wants to plant cover crops, what's the motivation behind that? Well, the big two, Soil health and conservation, so that, conservation and soil health was about half the underlying reason. And about a third of the reason was either livestock grazing or secondary forages. That means putting in a cover crop and then maybe cutting it for hay or something to that effect. So conservation and finding forages, another source of forage for livestock. Those were the leading reasons. And what about a rental discount when the tenant plants a cover crop? Should you take some off the cash rent? There are some benefits to cover crops that might last longer than a year. Which slowly changes the soil organic matter level, for example, whatever. Well, about 68% of the time, we don't see people taking a discount. 23% we see 1 to 9, and then 7% 10 to 20. I would tell you, if you want someone to do something, the best way to do that is to incentivize them. If it's costing 30 bucks an acre to put in a cover crop, you know what? I'll take off $15 an acre in cash rent, or reduce your cash rent, or I'll reimburse you, or I'll pay half the bill. That's a good way to negotiate and make things happen. A few tips on leases. Remember, if you are on a verbal lease, or what some might call a handshake lease, you needed to let that other person, you needed to give them termination notice by September 1st. I suggest even before September 1st, if you wish to go and find a different landlord or tenant, or change the cash rent. Now, if both the landlord and tenant mutually agree, you know what, we want to part ways, or we want to do something different, that's fine at that point. But if you did not let that other person know, whatever provisions you had for the 2024 growing season are going to carry forward into 2025. That's why we strongly suggest whether a cash lease, grazing land lease, crop share lease, really good resources, aglease101.org. There are leases that were paid for as part of a grant project, and you can download them, write on them, do whatever you'd like with them. So take a look at that website. Grazing land leases are a little bit different than cropland leases when it comes to a verbal lease. If you have a property that, you know what, I'm only going to rent it from May to October, or maybe June to November, so we're kind of right on the tail season of grazing land, and there was not an agreement in there that that tenant was going to be doing off-season grazing or cutting part of the pasture for hay or something. It was a 5-month lease. If it's a 5-month lease, technically that means that lease ends when the livestock are removed. Unless the tenant agrees, hey, I want to be able to hunt deer on or pheasant or something on that property, and if they want that, that's fine. But just be aware that that definitely influences these lease arrangements. So 5-month leases do not specifically require a termination notice, but it is common courtesy and good communication to let that other person know if you want to do something different. Increase, decrease, go with a different tenant, whatever. Go with a different landlord too. The website is aglease101.org. If you go on there, it's a blue colored website. Hit document library. One side you have the lease publications, the other side you have the lease forms. Click on it, PDF lease. And if you don't have a computer, not comfortable using it, ask a family member. Stop by a local public library. I bet you could probably print a lease off for $1 or $2. They're really cheap. And you can always make copies of them too. So find someone to help you out if you don't have a lease, but just know that they are online. Wanted to announce that we have our land management meeting series through the end of December now scheduled. Shannon Sand and Jessica Groskopf, Anastasia Meyer, and myself will be helping with these meetings. The complete listing of in-person meetings, which will feature a portion of today's presentation, but it goes a lot deeper into leases. And also questions like livestock liability if they get on a public roadway. All these things will be featured in this workshop. And I think this is really, we've done a lot of good work, but I think this has been one of our best meetings that we've done in a while. It's a really well put together series. So we really appreciate that. I just wanted to feature some of the upcoming. We're going to start out west first. We're going to be in North Platte and Kearney, York, and Alliance. If you'd like to attend one of these, just call the local extension office. We needed to make sure that we have enough people coming to ensure we're going to have the speakers go out and conduct these meetings. We also have another meeting in Northeast Nebraska, in Norfolk. Sydney will be at the Southern Platte NRD, but once again, you just got to call the local extension office. We'll also be in Meade, on O'Neill. And also we have Wilbur scheduled on the 12th, and then Dakota City. There will be additional dates in eastern Nebraska after the first of the year. We haven't scheduled all those, just be aware that they are coming. The other thing Anastasia and I work on together is called Land Management Quarterly. We have one coming up, I believe that's on the 18th. Let me check my calendar on my phone here quick. Yes, the 18th is correct. And we'll be featuring a little bit of information on all the 2024 county level cash rents. And also a little look at the farm programs, farm income in Nebraska. And Anastasia will be taking a little bit of a look at kind of closing out the leases. And if you have any questions, in addition to answering them here today, be sure to submit them on this. And it's Land Management Quarterly with the Center for Ag Profitability. Okay, I see that Ryan Evans has made a few comments to everyone. And the webinar is going to be featured there. And also, if you'd like to watch this recording, be sure to take a look at the Center for Ag Profitability website. And I got a couple questions, so I will answer them here. We had an anonymous question. Can you discuss subletting or subleasing grazing cropland, crop residue, so I'd assume like corn stalks, for example, on a cash rental lease? What should you be looking for? Okay, unless the right is specifically withheld in a cash lease arrangement or a crop share that the landlord doesn't want the property to be subleased, the tenant can sublease that property to someone else unless the right or unless the ability to sublease is withheld in the lease. What I tell people, what I'm seeing right now, farm finances are tight on the cropland side. Tenants are looking for alternative ways to make a little bit additional money off the ground to help pay the cash rent. Subleasing to someone else is fine. I would want to see if you are going to sublease, does that person that owns the livestock, do they have insurance on them? So if something happens, everyone has coverage the way it needs to be covered. And also, corn stalk grazing, old ranchers adage, you graze half, you leave half. So you have some coverage. Baling of corn stalks is okay, but let's do this in a cyclical rotation unless you're hauling manure or something else back out there. Well, I mean cyclical, maybe you do it once out of every 3 years or 4 years. If you do it every year, it can start impacting that soil organic matter unless you're hauling livestock waste or something that has a higher organic matter to transpose some of the loss of those nutrients. So just be aware of that. All right, next question came from David. What macro level factor that influences cash rental rates may be impacted by who wins the presidential election today? Boy, that is a good question. And I'll also remind you I'm being recorded currently, so I'll keep my that's you can't say anything about the election and not make someone upset. The things I keep an eye on. What's the future direction of trade related to the corn, soybeans, and different crops that we're growing in our state? It appears yields have been favorable on average. Yes, some areas were dry, but I'm talking the entire corn belt. It seems like yields are fairly favorable, and that's why we're seeing maybe a little bit lower prices right now. Keep an eye on that. The Federal Reserve operates independently of the executive branch. So, interest rates, we talked about that a little bit. Interest rates do influence cash rents to an extent. If you got to borrow the money, definitely influence land. Keep an eye. Also, we got to get a farm bill passed. Either we're going to have a one bill farm year. In the past, when we're operating without a farm bill, either we do a 1 year extension, or we need to offer up another 5 year. The farm bill, remember, it's just not farm programs, but there's also supplemental nutrition assistance program money in that. And some of the debate surrounding the farm bill passage is at what level should the funds be appropriated for some of these different programs inside of it. So keep an eye on that. And subject what happens today, make sure and get out the vote today. Let your voice be known. There's a lot of local, state, and national things on the ballot. So stay well informed with that.
You also have a question in the chat, Jim. I don't know if you saw that or not.
Let's see here. All right, we had a question from Adam. Considering rainfall is somewhat consistent over eastern Nebraska and the growing season is a little bit longer in southeast Nebraska, why is northeast Nebraska consistently having the highest cash rent? Well, there are some rainfall in the growing season definitely influence it. Southeast Nebraska, there are periods of time when it gets, yes, it is a longer growing season, but they might have extended periods of drought or heat. So that's one big thing. Also, the presence of livestock. Northeast Nebraska has a lot of livestock, Cumming County, um, other areas up there as well, but a lot of livestock with cattle on feed. So that creates additional motivation or competition. And a lot of operations still have a lot of livestock. Southeast Nebraska, yes, there is livestock, but maybe not to quite the degree that Northeast Nebraska has it. So all those things influence it. All right. Any other comments? Ryan Evans, our media specialist, typed in there. There's 2 hyperlinks. If you click on the chat, I would copy those or save those into your favorites on your web browser. If you'd like to attend Land Management Quarterly or any details on our upcoming meetings that Shannon will be helping out with. And if you got, out in Western Nebraska, I think Shannon can help you out with some of the meeting logistics, or if you got additional questions out there. So Shannon, what else did I miss, or what else would you like me to cover?
I think you got it all. So yeah. Thank you to everybody for joining us today during Ag Smart Money Week. The free webinars will continue through Friday, and you can find the schedule and registration information at cap.unl.edu/smartmoney. As you close out of Zoom, you will see a brief evaluation about today's webinar, and we'd really appreciate your feedback about this presentation and any ideas for future sessions. Have a great afternoon. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, everyone.